by talking a bit about your background maybe and how you got into writing in Australia.
Well, my name is Badham, and I am a playwright, but I also identify as a dramaturg, and these days I write fiction for money as well, which was an interesting place for me to end up. But essentially my background is that I'm from a working class family from the southern suburbs of Sydney, beautiful Sydney, Australia. It's actually a city of 5 million people, but has one of the smallest theatres to people, professional theatres to people ratios, I think, in the Anglophonic world. It's quite surprising. Even though we have an interesting and diverse theatrical culture, it's very, very hard to get a break for mainstream theatre. I was involved in youth drama and started writing professionally when I was 15 as part of a youth theatre company, where I was sort of encouraged to move away from acting because it was never going to be, I'm too short, too fat, too ugly. I got told to be a professional actor in Australia, so I got into writing, which was more my thing anyway. And then I went to the beautiful University of Wollongong on the south coast of New South Wales and really focused on my playwriting and my theatrical craft there. I've also worked as a cabaret performer, and I've worked as a writer for physical theatre. And essentially I've tried over the course of my training and my professional life experience to just be involved in as many different kinds of theatre as I can be. In 2001 I got a very large grant from the Australian government to write a play about my beautiful hometown of Wollongong, where I'd been at university. And the play was called Kitchen. It was about human resource managers and, of course, you know, the globalisation of industry, which destroyed, you know, the Wollongong working class, and steelworks getting shut down, blah, blah, blah. And because the theatre in my local town, we were under Conservative government in Australia at the time, the theatre had resorted to getting funds from BHP Billiton in order to complete its funding shortfall. They went berserk about me writing this play about the collapse of the steel industry, and the play never went on. But I'd been paid, so at the University of Wollongong I applied for an exchange to go to the University of Sheffield, which is our Steel City sister. And at Sheffield Uni I turned up with this play about industrialisation in a town that nobody who's not from there can even pronounce, and handed it to my tutor, who was Dominic Shellard, a very great friend of Michael Grandage, who at the time was artistic director of Sheffield Theatres. This is just before I came to Don My Warehouse, and he thought it was hilarious, and he told my tutor that if there were students who were interested in producing and directing it, he would give the play a season at the Sheffield Crucible. So I got my first professional break, not in my home country really, even though I'd had a grant, but in this country. And the original director was James Grieve, who many years later is now the assistant director of Payne's Plough, with George Perrin, who was in the original production. And I just happened to be at Sheffield University in the golden generation, where there were a number of people who have since gone into fairly impressive jobs in the theatre sector in this country. There's James and George. Lucy Purple, who wrote Enron, was there when I was there. D.C. Moore, who's now got quite a reputation as a playwright. Dan Bird, who does a lot with the Royal Exchange Manchester. Justin Outerbear, who's involved with the RSC. Alan Lane, who runs Slunglow, who's also attached to the West Yorkshire Playhouse. It was quite an incredible collection of people who were all there at the same time. And I went back to Australia stupidly after being at Sheffield Uni, having my play out at the Crucible and it all happening, and I could not get any work. And then I got a phone call from James Grieve saying, I'm going to take your play to the Edinburgh Festival, do you want to come? And I wasn't doing anything else, so I bought a ticket and came back. And at Edinburgh I got discovered. There was an amazing review from Lynn Gardner in The Guardian, and I got a phone call from the Royal Court saying, would you like to do an international project with us? And of course I said yes, and I emigrated, and I made the decision I wasn't going to go home until I ran out of work. And I never ran out of work. I got jobs from the BBC and trained on radio writing with the BBC, and I've since trained on TV and done all kinds of different things here. But stupidly fell in love with the child, boy, man thing, and went back to Australia a few years ago when my life collapsed for lots of personal as opposed to professional reasons, which is always so disappointing. And then I fought my way back to England, got out of a fairly messy relationship, and I've been back here since 2009. In that time because back when I went back to Australia, I worked as a festival director, which was my first proper job in literary management, even though I was also lecturing in writing for theatre and writing for screen at the University of Wollongong, and doing all kinds of master classes and different kinds of dramaturgy workshops, and really sort of honing my dramaturgical practice. And certainly after the experience of being a festival director and sort of turning this fairly crappy festival around somewhat, I got made associate artist at the Tamarama Rock Circus, who are basically the old Fitzroy, which is probably your only like mid-level Hampstead, Finborough sort of cross in Sydney. There's no real middle sector there. There are one or two venues that sort of operate on a fringe level, and you have Sydney Theatre Company, Bell Club from the big theatres, and then really only the old Fitzroy in the middle. And I started my own production company and produced 7 shows, one of which is an international tour. And I mean, in Sydney it's very much creating your own work. But during that time back at home, my agent was tearing my hair out because I couldn't get a main stage season of my own work. Like essentially, if I wanted to do things, I had to produce it. I was very good at producing other people's plays. And she suggested I start writing novels, and I did, and I got a book deal like that. Like, literally, the book went out on a Friday, and I had 3 offers on the table by the Monday. And for someone who's been in the theatre for a long time and is so used to having to, like, beg and, you know, crawl on my hands and knees for approval, the difference in my theatrical experience to the experience in publishing was shocking. Like, I just couldn't believe I got an audience that quickly, and people say things like, we like your work, actually translated into paid opportunities. Like, it was quite surprising. I mean, of course, the other thing you notice about publishing is that it's the land of estrogen. Like, you are actually in Amazon Kingdom. And I think that has, you know, that's one of the reasons why that culture is a lot more receptive to the work of women. And I write genre fiction, which, of course, you know, women are allowed to prosper and thrive at. Literary fiction is a bit of a different story, and it's very much a boys' game. I mean, I got all of this money for my book, for the event, and I came back to London because I wanted to pick up where I left off. And of course, it's been almost impossible as a playwright to do that, because here, when you're out, you are out, and it's very hard to get back on the ladder. But I hadn't burned all of my bridges, fortunately, and I had a really good relationship with Finborough, and they were talking to me about including the new script I was working on in their Vibrant season, which is their annual festival of new writing. And at the same time, the Jobs and Literary Manager came up, and I applied, and they gave it to me. So since then, like, I've been there for a year, and I've put together a writing development group, and I've built a writing development ensemble, and I'm really, really grateful to the Finborough because they've given me the space to trial the kind of dramaturgical practice I'm interested in, which is a performance-focused pro-writer dramaturgy. Often, like, in English-speaking culture, like, we find the role of the dramaturg a bit tricky. Like, in London, it's something that you would, when you use the word, you're usually talking specifically about people who work in devised theatre or promenade performance or live art, and the idea that a dramaturg, as opposed to just a literary manager, will be part of a development process. It's quite an interesting space because it's not very defined. And certainly the relationships that I'm developing with other dramaturgs in London, I'm quite a novelty because I work with narrative and text. Like, oh, the best place of narrative and text. So I work with writers to get their heads around the notion of stagecraft, because often people who have unique voices and unique insights and are literary don't have the experience, and often because of the Finborough, we work with writers who come from nowhere, who have maybe never sat in a rehearsal room before. Giving them the exposure to the creativity and the creative potential of actors is the best thing you can do for their writing, and certainly I see myself as a facilitator between writing creativity and performative creativity. Well, I mean, certainly the exposure made all the difference to my career, and realistically, like, my first Edinburgh was 2002, and in many ways my reputation is still built on what happened 9 years ago. I mean, I think at the time, because, I mean, everything happened for me so quickly. Like, I had this script and was in Sheffield, and then, you know, James Grieve and George Perrin were on their trajectory. And, you know, this was the right vehicle for them. It was what they could produce and wanted to produce, and the rest of it. I think I was really fundamentally ungrateful for the amount of effort they put into making that happen and the amount of money involved. I mean, being Australian, I mean, I just didn't know. It wasn't until I started producing years later that I was like, holy Christ, like, and I know that James Grieve paid for those early productions on his credit card, you know, and, I mean, obviously fundraised, but it's very, very difficult to imagine how that opportunity couldn't have happened unless I just happened to meet young people who were, honestly putting together CVs for professional practices, directors and producers, and they were extraordinary and very gifted, and I was incredibly lucky. But certainly if I hadn't have met them, the experience would have been completely different. And unless you have somebody on board who is going to be a producer, who knows exactly, who, if they don't know exactly what they're doing, are prepared to learn from that experience and build it in the next step. Edinburgh's disastrous because Edinburgh is £10,000, at least. And the fundraising and the effort and the financial management that goes on about it. I mean, people tell me, oh yeah, I'm thinking of doing the Edinburgh Festival. And I'm like, well, if you want to understand what it's like, get £10,000 in cash and put it in a pile on the ground and then cover it in petrol and then piss on it and then set it on fire. And that's the best preparation for the experience, because you're just going to hemorrhage cash. And there's no guarantee. I mean, and I walked into Edinburgh, I had a great script, I had an enthusiastic, I flattered myself, I had a great script. It was, one of the best things I've ever written. And I was just really lucky that I'd had that sort of chutzpah in my creative life to come up with something like that. And all these great, enthusiastic young people involved. And it took off, and it had an audience, and it sold out, and it was great. But subsequent Edinburghs, I haven't been so lucky. I've done scripts of mine that I've really loved and believed in, that there's been a casting problem or a directorial mismatch or something has gone wrong in the production, and that's theatrical life, and it's a learning experience, and that's what happens. But I remember one year I did a show that I was incredibly proud of, and it got a 3-star review in the Scotsman, and that was essentially season over, time to go home. And whether the show deserved it or not, is always going to be a subjective opinion. I mean, criticism is subjective. But it was devastating. And then you're stuck there in Scotland, trying to keep your actors' morale up, because you've still got to sell tickets, and it's actors who sell tickets because they're the pretty ones who hand them out. And it can be a really demoralising experience. My Edinburgh in 2009, I decided was my last. Next time I go to Edinburgh, I'm going to be invited to go, because I'm too old now, and it's hard work, and it's physically hard work.